They would say afterward that the laughter was the worst of it, worse than the words, because the words at least had the decency to be brief. It was the 9th of November, a morning of hard white frost that had come early and stayed, and the library at Ellenmore was cold in the particular way of rooms that are heated only for occasions. The late Duke had been 3 weeks in the ground. The solicitor, Miss Halloway, had come out from the county town with his clerk and his black tin box, and the family had assembled in the order that such families always assemble, which is to say by rank and by expectation. The new Duke of Ellenmore sat by the fire with his boots crossed at the ankle. His mother's sister sat near the window with her hands folded on the head of her stick. Lady Celia Marchmont, who was not family and had been invited nonetheless, sat where the light fell most kindly. And the Duchess of Ellenmore sat a little apart, in the chair nearest the door, in a grey wool gown that had been turned once and would be turned again, with her hands quiet in her lap and her back very straight, the way a woman sits when she has learned that stillness is the only privacy available to her in a room full of people who are watching. Mr. Holloway read for 40 minutes. He read the entail, which no one disputed. He read the legacies to the servants, which were generous, because the old Duke had been generous to everyone except his son. He read the bequest of the Hertfordshire property to a cousin, and the library to the Duke, and the miniature of the first Duchess to the aunt, and the small sums set aside for the tenants of the northern farms. And then he came to the end of a page and turned it, and said that there remained one property not otherwise disposed of, being the freehold of Renthorp in the northern parish, comprising a cottage, its outbuildings, and some 90 acres of adjoining land, and that the late Duke had directed that this should pass to the discretion of his heir. There was a small silence while everyone worked out what was meant by discretion. Renthorp was a joke in the family, and had been for 30 years. It was a stone cottage on the wrong side of the ridge, with half its roof gone and the other half going, standing in the middle of 90 acres of sour ground that had defeated 3 tenants and drowned the hopes of a 4th. It was the sort of property that men mention at dinner when they wish to say that they own something worthless, and wish also to be admired for the saying. The Duke looked at his wife. He was in a good humour that morning, which was rarer than it should have been, and the good humour of a man who is rarely in one is a dangerous thing, because he does not know its weight. He said, "Take the half-roofed cottage." And then he laughed. That was all. He did not mean it as a blow. He would have said so later, and it would have been true, and it would not have mattered. He meant it as the kind of remark that a man makes to a room in order to be at ease in it, and the room obliged him, as rooms do. His mother's sister did not laugh. Lady Celia Marchmont laughed the most musically, and put her hand to her throat as she did it, which was a thing she did when she wished to be looked at while laughing. The cousin laughed. The clerk did not laugh, but permitted himself a smile at the floor, and the Duchess of Ellenmore said, "Thank you." She said it clearly, without haste, in the voice of a woman accepting a gift. Then she asked Mr. Halloway whether the freehold was entire and unencumbered, and Mr. Halloway, who had gone rather pink, said that it was entirely, and that the deeds were in the box. She asked whether he might have them copied and sent to her by the end of the week. He said that he might. She thanked him a second time, and folded her hands again, and the reading went on to its conclusion, and nobody in that room, not one of them, understood that they had just watched a woman accept something. If you have ever been made the small joke of a room you had every right to sit in, if you have ever had to say thank you in a steady voice while the laughter went around you like weather, then you already know exactly what she felt. And you know also that the composure costs more than the tears would have. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight, and if you find yourself in this story, stay with her, because she is going to be all right, and it is going to take some time. The party broke up before noon. The Duke went out with the cousin to look at a horse. Lady Celia stayed to luncheon, and was charming to the aunt, who was not charmed, and the Duchess went upstairs to the room she had occupied for 4 years and rang for nobody, and sat for a while on the edge of the bed with her hands still folded, and then she rose and began, without hurry, to sort her linen into 2 piles. She left on the Thursday at 7 in the morning, in weather that had not improved. There was no scene. There is never a scene in these houses. The whole architecture of them is designed to prevent one. She had spoken to Mrs. Dawes, the housekeeper, on the Tuesday, and to Mr. Pell, the steward, on the Wednesday, and she had written 4 letters and paid 2 small accounts, and left the household books squared to the penny on the desk in the morning room, with a slip of paper on top listing the 3 things that would need attention before Christmas, in her own hand, which was small and upright and disagreeably legible. She took the grey gown and the brown one and the good black one. She took her mother's workbox and the book of figures she had kept since she was 19. She took the £240 that were hers absolutely under the settlement and not 1 shilling of anything else, and she left behind the pearls, the garnets, the sapphire drop that had been a wedding gift, and the ring, which she placed in the small dish on the mantel where he kept his seals, because she did not wish it said afterward that she had taken anything. Mr. Pell asked her at the door whether she wished the carriage. She said that she did not. She said that the carrier's cart went north from the crossroads at 7:30, and that she had spoken to the man and he would take her box. Mr. Pell was 61 years old and had served the house since he was 14, and he said afterward to his wife, and later to a good many other people, that in all that time he had never once been frightened by a quiet woman until that morning. She walked out through the door and down the drive and turned north, on foot, in the frost, and the last the house saw of her was a grey figure at the lodge gates with her hands in her sleeves, waiting for a cart. The Duke did not know she had gone until he came down at 10. He was told by Mrs. Dawes, who told it flatly, and he laughed again, because that was the habit that had got him into it, and said that she would be back before dark, and that the North Parish in November would cure her of the notion within the hour. At 2 o'clock he said it again with less certainty. At 6 he went himself to the window twice. At 9 he said to no one that he would not be made a fool of in his own house, which was interesting, because no one had made him one. He had done it himself, in front of witnesses, and had been laughing at the time. He did not send for her. This is the fact upon which the next 11 months turned, and he knew it, and he would say so eventually. Plainly, without dressing it up, he did not send for her, because to send for her would have been to admit before the household that something had happened, and he had spent his whole life arranging his affairs so that it could never be said that something had happened to him. So he dined alone, and drank rather more than he generally did, and slept badly. And in the morning he rode out to the Marchmont Place because Lady Celia had a new mare she wished him to see, and he was gone 3 days. Meanwhile, his wife was 4 miles north of the ridge, standing in the middle of a stone cottage with a floor of beaten earth, looking up through a hole in the roof at a sky the colour of a knife. Renthorp had not been lived in for 9 years. There were nettles in the doorway and a jackdaw's nest in the chimney, and one shutter hanging by a single hinge, and the smell of the place was the smell of cold stone and old rain. The Duchess of Ellenmore stood in it for perhaps 2 minutes without moving. Then she went out to the carrier, who was waiting to see whether she would ask him to take her back, and asked him instead whether he knew of a man in the parish who could cut and lay thatch. He said that there was old Jem Sowerby at Ridding, who had done it all his life and had nothing to do all winter but be old. She asked what such a man would charge. He told her. She counted out the money into her palm and looked at it and put it away, and said that she would see Jem Sowerby in the morning. That night she slept in the dry corner of the cottage under 3 blankets with her boots on, and the frost came in through the hole and lay on the top blanket like a dusting of flour. And she did not cry, because she had not cried at the reading, and could not think of a reason to begin now that she was warm and alone, and nobody was watching. She had, at that moment, 90 acres of land that nothing would grow on, a cottage with half a roof, £240, and no husband to speak of. She had also, though it would be spring before anybody but she understood it, the only thing she had ever really needed, which was the freehold, entire and unencumbered, of a piece of ground that belonged to nobody but herself. It is necessary to go back 4 years, because nothing that happened at Renthorp makes sense without it. Eleanor Ashcombe was the daughter of a corn factor who had done extremely well for 11 years, and then, in the space of a single autumn, extremely badly. She had been raised to expect a life of moderate comfort, and had been taught, because her father had no sons and a great deal of business, to keep his books. She was 19 when she began doing it in earnest, and 22 when she understood, 3 months before he did, that the house of Ashcombe was going to fail. And she had the figures to prove it, and she laid them before him on a Sunday evening, and he looked at them for a long while and said, "You are quite right, my dear, and I would be obliged if you would say nothing to your mother until after Michaelmas." That was the whole of her education in what men do with unwelcome accuracy from a woman. They concede it and ask for silence. The marriage was arranged in the following spring by 2 solicitors and an uncle. The Ellenmore estate was land rich and cash poor, as such estates generally were by then, and the old Duke was ill, and the heir had debts of the ordinary sort and a mortgage of the extraordinary sort on the western farms. Ashcombe had, out of the wreck, exactly 1 asset left unencumbered, which was a sum of £11,000 settled on his daughter that no creditor could reach. So a title married a settlement, as titles did. She was told on a Tuesday, and met him on a Friday, and married him 9 weeks later in a church full of people who had come to look at her and had gone away saying that she was well enough, and sensible, and not at all what they had expected, which was the closest thing to approval that county society ever gave to a woman who had arrived from trade. He was not unkind to her. That was the thing that would be so difficult to explain afterward to anyone who wanted the story to have a monster in it. Nicholas, Duke of Ellenmore, was 31 years old, well-made, well-read, careless with horses and careful with money, and he was polite to his wife at breakfast every morning of his life. He simply was not present. He had a manner of leaving a room while remaining in it that she had never encountered before and never entirely got used to. He asked after her health and did not wait for the answer. He praised the arrangement of the table and could not have said who had arranged it. And underneath all of it, running like a cold stream under a floor, there was the thing that had happened to him at 24, which nobody in the house ever mentioned, and everybody in the county remembered that he had been engaged to Celia Marchmont, and that she had ended it 11 days before the wedding by letter, and that the letter had been read aloud at a dinner in London by a man who thought it amusing. He had stood in the room while it was read. He had not moved a muscle in his face, and afterward he had made himself into a man who would never again be caught caring about anything in public, and he had done it so thoroughly that by the time he was 31 he had forgotten it was a costume. That was the wound, and it was a real one, and it explained him entirely, and it excused him not at all, and the difference between those two statements is the whole of what he had to learn. What he did not know in the 4 years of that marriage was what he had married. He knew she was quiet. He knew she was clever with accounts, in the way that a man knows his boots are leather. He did not know that within 8 months of coming to Ellenmore she had gone through the estate books back to 1806 and found £410 a year being lost between the home farm and the mill through, nothing more sinister than a habit of measuring one thing in bushels and another in sacks. He did not know that she had corrected it by writing 3 letters and had said nothing about it to anybody, or that Mr. Pell knew and had wondered for 2 years whether he ought to tell his master, and had decided each time that it was not his place. He did not know that she walked the northern boundary twice a year on foot, or that she had a plan, worked out in pencil in the back of her book of figures, for draining the sour ground beyond the ridge with a system of stone-filled trenches on the fall of the land, a thing she had read about in a Board of Agriculture report in his own library and had costed to the shilling. He did not know that the report had been in that library, uncut since 1811, and that the only pages in the whole volume that had ever been opened were the ones concerning drainage on cold northern clay. He did not know, because he did not ask, and she did not tell him, because she had learned at 19 what happens when you lay accuracy before a man who has not asked for it. And yet, it is important to say, because she would have said it herself if she had been the sort of woman who said such things aloud, that by the autumn of that 4th year something had begun. Not a great deal, not enough to name, but the household noticed it before either of them did, in the way that households always do. In the spring he had come into the morning room while she was working, and had stood behind her chair for the length of time it takes to read a column of figures, and had said, "You have a better hand than Pell," and had gone out again, and she had sat quite still for some minutes afterward. In June he had begun, without any announcement, to take his coffee in the morning room rather than the breakfast room, which meant that for perhaps 20 minutes on most days they were in the same room with the same silence, and it was not an uncomfortable one. In August, at the Assizes dinner, a man had asked him a question about the western drainage, and he had answered it, and then said, My wife would tell you more exactly, and she had looked up, and he had looked at her, and something had happened across that table that neither of them acknowledged for the rest of the evening. In September he began saying we. He did not know he was doing it. She counted it. That is the part that is hard to forgive the world for, she counted it, in the back of the book of figures. In a column with no heading, a small pencil mark for each time, and there were 19 marks by the end of October, and the last one was made on the 2nd of November, 7 days before the reading of the will, when he had said, at dinner, in front of the aunt, we shall have to do something about the North Parish before the spring. She had gone to bed that night with the particular quiet gladness of a woman who has been given no promise at all and has decided to hope on the strength of a pronoun. This is why the cottage mattered. Not the roof. The roof was nothing. Any woman who has kept a household knows what a roof costs and knows it can be mended. What could not be mended was that the North Parish had been the one thing he had said we about, and that 8 days later, in a room full of people who had come to hear what a family was worth, he had handed her the worthless end of it as a joke, and had laughed, and had not defended her, and had not looked to see whether she minded, because it had not occurred to him that there was anybody there to mind. She had hoped in private and been diminished in public. Those are not equal quantities and cannot be made to balance, and she was too good with figures to pretend otherwise. So she took the 90 acres and the North Road, and she took them for the reason that nobody at that reading would have believed if it had been explained to them, not because the cottage was an insult, but because it was, at last, hers. In the first week she paid Jem Sowerby £4.12 to strip what was left of the old thatch, and she worked beside him doing it, in a sacking apron, with her hair tied up in a cloth, and the parish came out in ones and twos to look at the Duchess of Ellenmore on a ladder, and went away with nothing to say. In the second week the roof was battened, and the chimney cleared, and the jackdaw dispossessed. In the third week she walked all 90 acres with a stick and a notebook, and marked the fall of the land, and where the water stood after rain, and where the rushes grew, because rushes tell you everything if you can read them. In the fourth week she called on the tenant of the neighbouring farm, a hard, decent, exhausted man named Corbett, who had 200 acres of the same clay and a wife with a cough, and asked him what he would take to dig trenches for her through the winter when there was no other work, and he told her that she was mad. And she said that she was probably right about that, but would like an answer to the question, and he named a price that was too low because he did not believe she would pay it, and she paid the first quarter of it in advance in coin on the table. By Christmas there were 11 men digging on Renthorp. She had them cut on the fall of the land as the report described, and fill the trenches with stone from the ruined outbuildings and the wall of the old sheepfold, and cover them, and by the middle of January the water was moving off that ground for the first time since anybody could remember, running down to the beck in a small brown rope. Corbett stood at the edge of it in the rain, with his hat in his hand, and watched it go, and said, "Well," and then did not say anything else for a long while. At Ellenmore the weather in the house changed, and nobody could say precisely how. The meals came up at the same hours, the fires were lit. The Duke rode and shot in December with a party of 8, and went up to London for a fortnight in the New Year, and came back, and it was all exactly as it had been before he married, which was the difficulty, because he had not noticed it becoming something else, and therefore could not account for the loss of it. He began to find her everywhere in the absence of her. The first was small and made him irritable rather than sorry. He wanted the figure for the mill repairs and could not find it, and rang for Pell, and Pell brought the household book from the morning room. And he opened it and saw the columns in that small upright hand, and, in the margin against the mill, in pencil, the words ask about the second wheel. C says it is idle 6 weeks in the year. He sat with that for some minutes. C was Corbett. He did not know at that point that his wife had ever spoken to Corbett in her life. In February he was obliged to look into the western drainage himself and went to the library for the Board of Agriculture volume, and found it, and found that its pages had been cut in exactly one place, and that against the paragraph describing stone-filled trenches on the fall of the land, somebody had made a pencil line in the margin and written a single word, which was Renthorp. He stood in the cold library holding the book open at that page for a length of time he could not afterward account for. He read her marginalia that winter the way another man might have read her letters, because there were no letters. She had not written to him, and he had not written to her, and the silence between them had the awful symmetry of two people each waiting for a thing that only one of them was capable of beginning. He learned her from the traces. He learned that she had been correcting the estate's arithmetic for 4 years without mentioning it. He learned from Mrs. Doole, who told him with the flat courtesy of a servant who has decided that her master may take her notice if he does not care for her answers, that the Duchess had visited the Bell cottages every Tuesday through 2 winters with soup and quinine, and had asked that nothing be said about it. He learned from the church that she had paid for the schoolmistress at Ridding out of her own money since the 2nd year. He learned from Pell, at last, in March, in an interview that both men remembered for the rest of their lives, exactly how much money she had saved the estate, and exactly how long Pell had known, and exactly why Pell had not told him. And when he asked the last of those questions, Pell looked at the floor and said, "Because I did not think your Grace would care to hear it from me." He asked what that meant. Pell said, "It would have meant the Duchess was cleverer than the master of the house, your Grace, and there is no comfortable way for a steward to say so." And the Duke, who had spent 7 years constructing a man who could not be caught caring in public, discovered that he had built a house in which no one could tell him anything true. He rode north on the 22nd of March. He did not go to the cottage. He came over the ridge in the late afternoon and stopped at the top of it and looked down at Renthorp, and what he saw took some time to interpret, because it was not what he had come to see. He had come, if he was honest, and he was not yet honest, to find her cold and thin and defeated in a hovel, so that he could be generous. What he saw was a roof, a whole one, new thatch bright as a wheat field, and the chimney smoking, and the shutters mended and painted, and washing on a line. And beyond the cottage, the 90 acres cut across with the long dark lines of a drainage system laid out as neatly as ruled paper, and 8 or 9 men working at the far end of it, and a woman in a grey gown standing at the middle of it all with a notebook, pointing at something, while a man twice her width nodded at whatever she was pointing at. He sat on his horse on the ridge in the wind for a quarter of an hour. Then he turned round and rode home, and told nobody where he had been, and that night he did not drink and did not sleep. And at some hour before dawn he arrived, for the first time in his life, at a sentence about himself that had no comfort in it anywhere, that he had married a woman of the first quality, that he had been given 4 years to notice it, that he had begun, at the very end, to notice it, and that he had then, before witnesses, for the pleasure of a room, handed her the worst thing he owned and laughed. The following Tuesday Lady Celia Marchmont called at Ellenmore with her mother and stayed 2 hours and was extremely kind about the Duchess. Lady Celia had been a widow for 11 months by then, which in that county was the precise moment at which a woman of her sort became visible again, and she had come back into the neighbourhood with the manner of somebody resuming an interrupted sentence. She was kind about the Duchess in the way that is worse than cruelty, because it cannot be answered. She said that it was so brave of her. She said that not every woman was suited to the position, and that there was no shame in it, and that a small, quiet life among simple people was perhaps the happiest thing after all, and she said all of it with her eyes soft and her head a little on one side. And she said it in front of the aunt, which was a mistake, and in front of Mrs. Dawle carrying in the tea, which was a worse one, because by Friday there was not a servants' hall within 9 miles that had not heard the whole of it repeated in Mrs. Dawle's excellent imitation. She also said, as she was leaving, drawing on her gloves, that of course everyone understood the marriage had been what it had been, an arrangement, a matter of business, and that no one would think the worse of him for anything he chose to do about it now. The Duke saw her to the door and handed her into her carriage and said all the correct things, and stood in the cold afterward looking at the gravel, and thought, with a clarity that arrived far too late to be any credit to him, that he had once stood in a room and been laughed at because of a letter this woman had written, and that he had built his entire character out of that afternoon, and that he had then spent it, all of it, in one sentence, on his wife, in a library, in November. Meanwhile the 90 acres came grain. It happened faster than anybody in the parish had allowed for, because drained clay that has been sour for a century has a great deal of goodness stored in it, and only wants the water gone to begin giving it back. She sowed oats in the first spring, because oats forgive, and she put 20 ewes on the top ground that Corbett found for her at Ripon Fair. And by June the Renthorp oats were a hand higher than the oats on the good land on the other side of the ridge, and men were coming from 4 parishes to walk the field boundary and look, and having looked, to stand about at the gate with their hats pushed back, saying that it was the trenches, and that it had been done before somewhere in the East Riding, and that of course anybody could have seen it. What they did not say, because such men do not say such things directly, was said instead by their coming. In July the Agricultural Society at the county town wrote to Renthorp and asked whether the tenant would consent to have the drainage inspected by their committee, and she wrote back that the freeholder would be glad to receive them on any Thursday. In August the committee came, 7 men in good coats, and were shown over the ground by a woman in a sacking apron with a notebook, and asked her a great many questions, and got, to their considerable discomposure, exact answers to all of them, with costs, and were given tea afterward in a stone kitchen with a flagged floor and 1 good chair which she gave to the eldest of them. In September the county paper printed 4 inches about the Renthorp drainage, and named the freeholder as Her Grace the Duchess of Ellenmore, and that paper was read at every breakfast table within 30 miles, including one. And on the last day of that month, Lady Augusta Wren, who was 74 years old and the sister of the Duke's mother, and the only living person entirely unafraid of him, arrived at Ellenmore unannounced with her maid, her stick, her medicines, and her late nephew's orphaned daughter, and installed herself in the south bedroom, and sent word down that she would dine at 6 and would be obliged if there were no company. Prudence was 9. She had her father's colouring and her aunt's directness, and none of the family's talent for leaving things unsaid, and she had been at Ellenmore twice before, both times when the Duchess was in the house, and she had loved her in the wholly unreasonable and permanent way of a child who has been taken seriously exactly once by an adult who had no obligation to do it. She came down to dinner in a clean pinafore and sat where she was put and ate her soup and looked round the table, and then said, in the clear carrying voice of a child asking a question of no importance, "Where is she?" The Duke said that his wife was living on her own property in the North Parish. Prudence considered this. She said, "Why?" He said that it was a complicated matter and that she would understand it when she was older. And Prudence, who had been raised for 2 years by Lady Augusta Wren, and had therefore never in her life been fobbed off successfully, put down her spoon and said, "Did you send her away, or did she go?" There is a particular silence that falls at a table when a child has asked the question that 4 adults have spent 11 months constructing sentences to avoid, and it has a quality of ringing, like a struck glass. The footman by the sideboard studied the middle distance. Lady Augusta went on eating her soup with every appearance of pleasure, and the Duke of Ellenmore discovered that he could not produce an answer, because the truthful one was that neither of those things had happened. He had not sent her away, and she had not simply gone. He had put her out of the house with a sentence and a laugh, and then had waited, in comfort, for her to come back and forgive him for it, without his ever being obliged to say that it had occurred. He said, "At last I made a remark about a piece of property in front of a room of people, and it was unkind, and she took me at my word." Prudence said, "What did you say?" He told her. He told it exactly, which was the first entirely honest thing he had done in the matter, and he watched a 9-year-old's face take the measure of it, and it was not an experience he would recommend to anybody. Prudence thought about it for a while. Then she said, "But it was the worst house you had." He agreed that it was. She said, and she took it and made it the best one. And she went back to her soup, having, with perfect innocence, delivered the sentence that he would repeat to himself unwillingly several hundred times over the next 6 weeks. Afterward, when the child was in bed, Lady Augusta had the fire built up in the small parlour and told her maid to shut the door, and sat down opposite her nephew with her stick across her knees like a magistrate. She said, "I am going to say a number of things to you, and you will not interrupt, because I am 74 and I have earned it." She said that his mother had been a cold woman, who had never once in 40 years told him he had done well, and that everybody had known it, and that it was not his fault and had certainly been the making of the trouble. She said that Celia Marchmont had used him abominably at 24, and that the men who had laughed in that London dining-room had been vulgar and were mostly dead or ruined, and that he had, on the whole, been more damaged by 11 minutes of laughter than most men are by a war. She said that she had watched him build. Out of that, a manner that could not be got at, and that she had admired it for about 3 years, and had been sorry about it ever since. And then she said, "And now I shall tell you the thing you will not like. You are not a cruel man. You have never been cruel in your life. What you are is a coward in the one narrow place where it matters most, which is that you cannot bear to be seen to care for something in a room where somebody might laugh at you for it. That is all that happened in the library. You had begun to be fond of your wife. You had said "we" about the North Parish in front of me at your own table a week before, and I heard it, and I was glad. And then a room laughed, and you were frightened, and you gave the laughing room your wife rather than let it have you. That is the whole of it, Nicholas. There is no complexity in it. It is not a tragedy. It is a small, contemptible, ordinary failure of nerve, and it has cost you the only person in that family besides myself who was worth the powder to blow her to blazes. He did not answer for some time. Then he said, "What do you advise?" And Lady Augusta said, "I advise nothing." Advice is for people who intend to do very little. But I will tell you what will not answer, and that is going to Renthorp with a carriage and a speech and a great many sentences beginning with the word "surely." She will hear you out, because she is well bred, and she will say thank you, and you will come home, and you will have made it worse. He said, "Then what is left?" She said, "You did it in public. You will have to undo it in public, and it will have to cost you something in front of the same sort of people, or it means nothing at all. And after that you will have to do dull, unremarkable, unwitnessed things for a long while, which is the part that men like you find impossible, because there is no audience for it, and therefore no way of being admired for the doing." She got up, and gathered her stick, and paused at the door, and delivered the last of it with her back half turned, in the tone of a woman remarking on the weather, "And you had better be quick," because there was a paragraph about her in the county paper in September, and a widower of 40 with 1100 a year and no imagination read it in Northallerton, and he has called at Renthorp twice. The Agricultural Society held its annual dinner at the county town on the 7th of November, and it was, by long custom, the one night of the year on which the landed and the practical sat down together and pretended to enjoy it. There were 90 at table. The committee that had walked the Renthorp drainage in August was there in force. Lady Celia Marchmont was there, because her late husband had endowed a premium for shorthorns, and she had inherited the right to present it. Lady Augusta Wren was there, having declared that she had not attended in 19 years, and did not propose to explain herself now. The Duke of Ellenmore was there because he was president, and at a table near the middle of the room between Corbett and the secretary of the committee, in a plain dark gown with no ornament whatever, sat the freeholder of Renthorp, who had been invited in her own name and had accepted in her own name, and who had not seen her husband since the 9th of November of the previous year. The premiums were read after the second course. When the secretary came to the special commendation for drainage on cold clay and read out the name, there was applause of the kind that is loudest from men who have walked the ground themselves, and she stood up for as long as courtesy required and sat down again, and that would have been the end of it. But Lady Celia, who had drunk 2 glasses and had watched the applause with the expression of a woman doing arithmetic, said, to her own end of the table, in the pitched voice of somebody who intends to be overheard by rather more of the room than she is addressing, how charming it is. And to think it was only ever meant as a joke, one really must congratulate the Duke on his generosity, for I was in the room when he gave her the place, and I promise you nobody laughed harder than he did. Perhaps 30 people heard it. In a room of 90, 30 is enough. The thing goes round, the rest inside a minute, and the laughter began at Lady Celia's end and started to travel, and the Duchess of Ellenmore set down her glass and made herself perfectly still, because she had been here before and knew what was required of her and was prepared to do it again. And the Duke of Ellenmore stood up. He was president. The room came quiet for him, which is the only reason any of what followed was possible. He said that he would beg the company's indulgence for one moment. On a matter of fact, since the society was a body that concerned itself with facts, he said, Lady Celia is quite right. I was in the room. It was my remark, and I made it at my wife's expense, and I laughed at my own joke, and every word she has told you is true. He let that sit. Nobody moved. He said, what she has not told you, because she does not know it, is what the joke was. The joke was that I had, that morning, been given the disposal of 90 acres of the worst land in the North Riding and a cottage with no roof, and I could think of nothing better to do with it than make my wife the entertainment of a legal reading. I want it understood by this society, since this society has just given the ground a commendation, that I had owned that land for 11 years and had never once walked it. My wife had walked it twice a year for 4. She had costed the drainage of it, in pencil, in the back of her own book, out of a report that was in my library that I had not cut. She had corrected the arithmetic of my estate for 4 years and had told nobody, including me, and my steward did not tell me because he did not believe I would care to hear it. I am telling you this because it is the truth and because I have found that I would rather be thought a fool by 90 men who deal in facts than continue to be thought a wit by the sort of room that laughs at a woman's expense. He paused, and then said the last part, and it was said flatly, without any music in it at all. There is no generosity in this business, anywhere. I gave my wife a ruin as a joke, and she made it the best ground in the parish, and she did it without a shilling of mine, and without one word of complaint about me. In public, or, I am reliably informed, in private. That is the whole of the story. I would be obliged if the society would drink her health. 90 men stood up. Corbett got up so fast he knocked his chair over backward and did not pick it up. And in the middle of it, while the room was on its feet and the glasses were going up, the Duchess of Ellenmore sat in her plain dark gown, with her hands in her lap, and looked at her husband down the length of the table with an expression that nobody in the room could read, because it was not for them. He came to Renthorp 11 days later, on foot, over the ridge, in a hard sleet, having left the horse at Corbett's because the lane was too deep for it. She opened the door with a lamp in her hand and looked at him standing there wet through, and stood aside without a word, and he came into a stone kitchen with a flagged floor and a good fire and a scrubbed table with a book of figures open on it, and it was, he thought, the most comfortable room he had ever been in, and he did not say so, because he had learned in 12 months not to spend a compliment where an apology was owed. She gave him a chair and a towel, and made tea without asking whether he wanted it. He said, I have come to say a thing badly, and I would be grateful if you would let me get to the end of it. She said, Go on. He said, I diminished you in public because a room was laughing, and I wanted to be on the laughing side of it. That is the whole reason. There is no better one. I was not provoked, I was not tired, I did not mean it kindly and have it come out wrong. I have had a year to find a better account of myself, and there is not one. I was fond of you. I had begun to be more than fond of you, and when it came to the moment of choosing between a room's good opinion and my wife, I chose the room out of cowardice, and I laughed, so that no one could say I minded anything. I am not going to ask you to come back, because I have no right to ask you for anything, and because I have seen what you have made here, and I would not insult it by calling it a hardship you should be rescued from. I have come to say that I was wrong, and that I know exactly how I was wrong, and that if you never speak to me again, the account is still owing on my side and not on yours. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Thank you." And then, because she had never in her life been able to leave a thing imprecise, she said, "I am going to tell you what it cost, because you should have the figures." It was not the cottage. I was glad of the cottage. It was that 8 days earlier you had said we about the North Parish at your own table, and I had written it down. He said you wrote it down. She said in the back of the book. There is a column. There were 19. And the Duke of Ellenmore put his hand over his eyes and sat like that for some time in the chair by her fire. Afterwards she set out the terms, in the plain, unhurried way she would have set out an account, and he did not argue with any of them because there was nothing in them to argue with. She said that she would not give up the freehold, then or ever, and that Renthorp would remain hers absolutely and be worked as she chose. She said that she would not come back to Ellenmore before the following autumn, and that in the meantime he might call and might write, and she would answer. She said that the estate books would be hers openly, with her name in them, or not hers at all, and that Pell would be told so to his face by him, and not by her. She said that if she came back, she would come back to a house in which a man does not laugh at his wife in front of company, and that she would not be quarrelling about it if it happened. She would simply be at Renthorp again, and he should understand that as a settled fact and not a threat. And last, she said, "You will not do any of this quickly. I do not want a month of you at your best. I have had 4 years of a stranger who was polite at breakfast, and I would rather have 3 plain years of somebody who turns up." He said that he understood. She said, "I do not think you do yet, but you will." He came on Thursdays. That was all. Through that winter and the spring and the summer following, whatever else there was. On Thursdays a man rode over the ridge and left his horse at Corbett's and walked the last half-mile, and sat in a stone kitchen and was given tea and talked about drainage and lambing and the price of oats and the schoolmistress at Ridding, and did not once ask her to come home. In February he brought the Board of Agriculture volume and gave it to her, uncut pages and all. In April he took his coat off and helped Corbett and 4 others get a ewe and 2 lambs out of a flooded ditch, and ruined a pair of boots doing it, and was, Corbett reported, no use whatever, but wet to the waist and cheerful about it. In June he brought Prudence, who ran the last 200 yards. It was Prudence who ended it, in the way that children end things, by refusing to accept that a difficulty exists. She came in August and stayed a fortnight at Renthorp by her own arrangement, sleeping in the little room under the new thatch, and she learned to count sheep through a gate and to tell rushes from grass, and on the last evening, sitting on the step with her chin on her knees while the swallows went over, she said, "When you come home, may I have the room next to yours?" The Duchess said that nothing had been decided about coming home, and Prudence said, with the flat, unanswerable practicality that she had inherited from an aunt who was 75 and getting no gentler, "But he comes every Thursday, and you look at the clock on Wednesdays." That was in August. She came back to Ellenmore at the end of October, And she came back on her own terms and in her own way, not in his carriage but in the carrier's cart, with her box, up the drive on a cold, bright morning. And Mr. Pell was at the door and could not speak. And Mrs. Dall cried and was furious with herself about it, and the Duke came out bareheaded and stood at the bottom of the steps and did not laugh and did not make a joke and did not say anything clever, which was, she told him years later, the moment she was certain. Her name went into the estate books in November in his own hand on the first page, and Pell was told, to his face, exactly as she had required. The western drainage was begun the following spring on her plan. Lady Celia Marchmont married a baronet from Lincolnshire the year after, and was perfectly civil to the Duchess of Ellenmore at 4 county functions, and was never again invited to Ellenmore for anything, which was a punishment of precisely the size that the offence deserved, and was administered without a single word being spoken about it. Corbett took the tenancy of the whole northern block in 1823, and his sons had it after him. Prudence got the room next to theirs, and later a season in London that she disliked, and later, still, a husband she chose herself over the objections of everybody except her aunt by marriage, who said only that the arithmetic of the young man's expectations was sound, and that Prudence had better keep the books. And Renthorp was never sold, never let, and never given up. It stayed hers, entire and unencumbered, in her name in the deed box, for 51 years. They went up in the autumn always, the two of them, for a week, and then for a fortnight when the children were older, and they slept under the thatch in the little room, and ate at the scrubbed table, and the household at Ellenmore came to speak of it as a fixed point of the year, the way one speaks of Michaelmas. And every autumn, on the first fine day of the visit, the Duke of Ellenmore took off his coat and went up a ladder onto the roof of that cottage with old Jem Sowerby, and afterward with Jem Sowerby's son, and afterward with Jem Sowerby's grandson, and worked the whole day at the thatch, at 70 as at 40, badly at first and then not badly at all, until it was the tightest roof in the North Riding, and there was not 1 year in 51 that he missed it. The county thought it an eccentricity. The family knew what it was. Their eldest son asked about it once, at 19, and got the story from his mother in about 4 sentences, delivered without heat, at the end of which the boy said that he did not understand how she had forgiven it, and she said he mended the roof, and the boy said that anybody might mend a roof, and she said every year for 22 years in front of whoever was watching. That is not the same thing. He died in the spring of 1867 at Ellenmore in the morning with the window open. He had been failing since Christmas and had been quite clear about where he wished the thing to be got over with, and she had been quite clear that he was not going up a ladder again at any price. And they had compromised as they had compromised about everything for half a century, by both being obstinate in the same direction. What the household remembered afterward, and what Prudence told her own grandchildren, was that on the last morning he was awake and lucid for perhaps an hour, and that the Duchess sat by him with her hand in his, and that he said something to her that made her laugh, which nobody had expected, and that she was still holding his hand an hour later when it was over. Nobody asked her what he had said. She told them, in the end, when she was very old and past caring what a room thought of her, on an autumn evening at Renthorp, with the swallows going over and half the parish gone quiet outside to listen. He had turned his head on the pillow and looked at her, and said, in the voice of a man setting down a joke he had been carrying for 51 years, "Take the half-roofed cottage." And she had said, "I did."